There are not many paintings that capture an artist's friends gathered together simply for the purpose of having a good time. Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party, painted in 1880 to 1881, is certainly the most famous. But Cape Ann has its own spirited snapshot of an age. It's called New England Ladies, painted in 1925 by Teresa Bernstein. All friends of Bernstein's, the people in this work together represent an important community of women in the Folly Cove neighborhood of Gloucester in the early 20th century. Teresa Bernstein came to Folly Cove at the invitation of artists Ellen Day Hale and Gabrielle DeVoe Clemens, who were considered life partners. Cape Ann historian Barbara Ercola described Miss Hale as a leader in Folly Cove's art colony, which was composed mostly of women like herself who had stuck to their own guns and studied art, despite family traditions of becoming decorative hostesses while men achieved their own goals. Ellen Day Hale's self-portrait hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Gabrielle DeVoe Clemens studied painting under Thomas Eakins and etching under Stephen Parrish. She was known in art circles throughout the country as a printmaker and muralist. Clemens is credited with being the first artist to find beauty in a granite quarry. Lillian Westcott Hale was considered one of the most successful Impressionist artists from the Boston School. She was known for portraying idealized, thoughtful women, but also sensitive impressions of the women in her own family, like this portrait of the artist's mother. Lillian was married to Ellen Day Hale's brother. Lillian's daughter, Nancy Hale, would become the most prolific fiction writer in the New Yorker magazine's history. She would receive the O. Henry Prize for Short Fiction 10 times. She was known for her portrayals of complicated women. Here is Nancy Hale, featured in a 1936 issue of Harper's Bazaar. Dorothy Grafley would become a prominent Philadelphia art critic and correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and American Art magazine. She grew up in Paris. Her first playmate was Alexander Calder. Gertrude Stanwood studied painting with Miss Hale and Miss Clemens. The party is in her house. Mrs. Frisbee served meals in her own home across the street to Folly Cove visitors. There were sometimes 10 artists, including 2 future Prix de Rome recipients at her table. Mr. Burnham provided everyone with lobsters. Teresa Bernstein and her husband, artist William Meyerowitz, would for the rest of their lives divide their time between New York City and Cape Ann, capturing the social realities of urban America and Cape Ann in a changing century. Bernstein died in 2002 at what is thought to be 111 years. Nancy Hale would inherit her Aunt Nellie's, Ellen Day Hale's, Folly Cove Stone Studio, which so many of these friends, including Bernstein, had shared as creative space. Years later, Nancy reflected in a New Yorker piece on this group of artists, saying, "Once or twice, to my astonishment, I burst into tears. What astonished me was not so much that I should be crying, as what I realized I was crying about. It was not because my mother or Aunt Nellie was dead, or out of sadness for all those other artists, Aunt Nellie's friends, who also used this place long ago, but because in the silence of the studio, I remembered what a wonderful time they all had." Bernstein's painting testifies to that joy. And here's a last thought about this work by Teresa Bernstein. Duncan Phillips, founder of the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., purchased Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party in 1923. In December of that year, Bernstein attended an opening in Washington, D.C. at the Corcoran Gallery, where her painting, Girlhood, painted, by the way, in Ellen Day Hale's Stone Studio, was being exhibited. During that visit, Duncan Phillips purchased Bernstein's Girlhood for the Phillips collection. No one can know for certain, but it seems likely that Bernstein saw the new Renoir at the Phillips on that visit. The very next year, 1925, Bernstein painted New England Ladies, this joyous assembly of her own Folly Cove friends, older and younger guests bridging the past and future. Could she have been thinking about the vivacity in the Renoir when she composed this gathering of her own special friends? If this exhibition were held in Paris and the artist had some curious Gallic or Spanish name, it would create something of a sensation. It would touch the Gallic imagination as something new and different. These are lines from a 1935 Boston Globe art review covering an exhibition of paintings by the artist Emma Fordyce McCrae, then a 48-year-old woman from Park Avenue with a Gloucester summer home overlooking Stage Fort Park. McCrae's paintings have been described by critics as holding two things at once: a unique modernist abstraction and an early Renaissance essence. Her surfaces, laid on and scraped off layers of paint, demand that we think of old-world frescoes. McCrae's compositions, from a dogwood branch to a girl's portrait, lace meaning and structure together in ways that recall Japanese theories of design. Arthur Wesley Dow, who artists of the time revered, called it the rhythmic harmony of colored spaces. Born in 1887 in Vienna, Austria, raised in a wealthy New York suburb, Emma Fordyce McCrae was the only daughter of affluent parents. Her mother came from wealth and her father was a professor of dermatology at Columbia University. The family traveled extensively in Europe. Her father purchased land in Gloucester in 1916 and built the house on Old Salem Road, or Hermit Hill, that would thereafter be home to McCrae's summer artistic life. In 1910, a shadow did fall over the young Emma's apparently cloudless years. At age 23, she married an intern in her father's practice, Thomas McCrae. They had a daughter, Alice, right away, but the marriage barely lasted a year. It would be annulled in 1920, and McCrae would go on to marry Dr. Homer Swift in 1922. 1 year after that failed marriage in 1911, McCrae began classes at the Art Student League in New York City, and later at the New York School of Art. Her family wealth would situate McCrae easily in the living rooms of Gloucester's grand Eastern Point homes, where a portrait market flourished. But McCrae instead chose to paint among the more energetic and gritty Gloucester artists, like William Meyerowitz and her teacher John Sloan. They were all showing in the Gallery on the Moors, the first cooperative venue for Cape Ann artists. McCrae was also showing in New York and Boston. Prestigious institutions like the National Academy of Design, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and the Art Institute of Chicago began accepting her submissions. With her Gloucester colleague Teresa Bernstein, McCrae became a member of the Philadelphia 10, a group of women artists who exhibited together in defiance of the gender bias they were seeing in the art world. McCrae's emphasis on composition drew her away from the open ocean and towards the close architecture of Cape Ann's coves, particularly its northern, more prosaic coves. Hodgkin's Cove, Lane's Cove, and Pigeon Cove was her favorite, a quiet working-class nook farthest away from busy Gloucester. No lighthouses, no cresting waves, no muscled rowers. McCrae's emphasis on composition, the angles of boat to pier, the vertical of ladders,
The Pattern of Roofs, tells a felicitous story of these tiny inlets along Ipswich Bay built by granite and sea. Populated by people fishing or enjoying a day at the beach with work and families on their minds, not art. McCrae's work is hard to find. Most of it remains with her family. She didn't push the sale of her paintings in her lifetime because she lived extremely comfortably and could afford not to. She painted her subjects, flowers and women, loyal to her artistic vision, with deceptive spareness that belies a quiet tension. These are not simple paintings, although at first glance they seem it. On Cape Ann, she chose to paint the places her peers overlooked. In the intimacy of these coves and small-town life, McCrae seemed also to be admiring, maybe counter to her own life, the beauty and complexity of less. Helen Stein's portrait of the painter Marston Hartley hangs in the Cape Ann Museum, part of their permanent collection. Hartley, whose own work is represented in major museums, is considered one of the quintessentially American artists. This arresting painting delivers in spare lines the lonely human that was Hartley. Helen Stein was born in Odessa, Russia in 1896. She came to this country, to New York City, at the age of 2. In New York, she took art classes at the Art Student League and Cooper Union. She went to Paris in 1925 and steeped herself in the modern art movement there. She returned to the U.S. in 1927 and soon settled into the East Gloucester Art Colony, which in those years hosted great names in modern art like Hans Hofmann. But almost every account of Stein's life describe her not as an artist but a friend. Marston Hartley's friend, perhaps one of his few friends. He was a famously difficult person, ever struggling with his work, his peers, and the secret of his homosexuality. The Cape Ann Museum describes Stein as playing an essential role in shaping the fabric of the East Gloucester and Rocky Neck art colony and promoting modern art in the area. Like other sources, the Cape Ann Museum biography concludes by saying, she was a friend of Marston Hartley. The Smithsonian Museum has no images of Stein or her works, but rather include in their archives her 10 years of letters back and forth to Marston Hartley. In spite of the bold purity of her 20th century painting, we read about Stein in the Hartley margins. Hartley's biographer says of their relationship, Stein understood and liked Hartley and was willing to put up with his moods and his distaste for anyone he did not find interesting. They were together constantly. They walked on Wingersheek Beach, saw movies together, and often had meals at her place, gossiping about others among the Gloucester art colony, most of whom Hartley disapproved of. She enjoyed the banter and appreciated his loyalty to her, even if frequently it took the form of jealousy when she paid attention to other Gloucester artists who he did not like for one reason or another. Like so many women who are footnotes in famous men's lives, Stein, in fact, had a vivid and largely untold life apart from these reduced scenes. In 1942, in Stein's very public divorce from her husband, Ernest Thurn, who had started the Thurn School of Art on Rocky Neck, glimpses appeared of her past, very different from the fish houses and pitched easels of Rocky Neck. Stein told the court that in her years in Paris, this man, Sir Michael Croyer Keilberg, an English financier known as the Molasses King, had been her benefactor. The divorce was covered for days in the Boston Globe. In it, Stein testified that her paintings had made her the toast of Paris, and that Croyer Keilberg had commissioned the modernist architect Le Corbusier to build her an art studio, which later became the Japanese consulate. The Depression crushed Stein's European future. She said that Sir Michael purchased her East Gloucester home at 9 Marble Street, where she lived and painted until dying in 1964. The European millionaire also established a U.S. bank account for her, depositing $10,000 in it at first and continuing to send monthly checks of $125 and more. Stein's husband confessed to the court that he was drawn to her for this income, and because she said being married to a prominent artist like her would help his art school. We may know little about Stein except for those early years and her life proximal to Marsden Hartley, but her paintings, strong examples of the modernist tradition, have their own message. The lines in a Stein painting never waver. They may seem brutal or startling, but they never hesitate. The courage and sensitivity with which Stein's brush moved must have been a part of her. That courage and sensitivity must have been a part of her choice of Rocky Neck after Paris, of Sir Michael's monthly checks, of Marsden Hartley as a friend. In 1974, the realist painter Andrew Wyeth said the greatest American artist working in black and white was Stowe Wengenroth. Wengenroth was a lithographer. His work astonishes for its light, for its atmosphere, for its uncanny lens on the natural world. More than 24 major American museums include his lithographs in their permanent collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Fine Arts Museum in Boston. And yet, Stowe Wengenroth's New York Times obituary opens by saying he lived at 25 Parker Street in Rockport, Mass. Wengenroth seemed as satisfied with the provincial as he was with eminence. Provincial moments from New York to Maine were his subjects. Lithography is an intricate and complex printmaking process that revolves around the basic premise that ink and water repel each other. A lithographer draws with an inky pen or brush on thick slabs of limestone, sometimes weighing 80 pounds. A complex chemical solution fixes and etches the drawing. The stone is dampened with water and then inked. The oil-based ink finds the greasy areas of the drawing. The damp areas repel the ink and become the light parts of the drawing. The soft stone codifies the tiniest artist mark. Lithographs invite you to come up close, to see the fragility of a line or the grace of darkness. Artists love this medium, and it's how Wengenroth chose to record the way the Atlantic Ocean meets the shore for most of his 50-year career. Wengenroth's step-granddaughter, Mindy Trafton, grew up at that same Rockport address and remembers her grandmother's husband fondly. She called him Goofy. Her grandmother and Wengenroth played music together. He played the mandolin and she played the piano and ukulele. He never drove, Trafton said, but walked everywhere. Found in the Trafton family Parker Street possessions was this canister of film from 1977, the beginning of a documentary intended for public television by a young filmmaker named Mary Arbuckle. Recently digitized, the film is a startling but happy leap across the years. There is Stowe Wengenroth himself, talking about lighthouses, walking, and the nature of limestone.
I think it was an asset not to have a car, really.
Gee, I don't like my...
Why?
Rocky.
It gives you more time to see things, Mary. You can't see much as you're driving along, and everything just moves by. Usually I'd find my next subject when I was walking back from one I was just done. I would have liked to have devoted my life to doing lighthouses. Like, I don't mean to compare myself with Audubon, but the way he did birds. Make a print of every lighthouse, because there'll never be another one built. They're tearing them down, they're not building them anymore, you know? You can't work on a stone in the hot weather because the pencil melts and all like that, and the grease runs. So I'd always go in the summer and get my drawings. I'd always come back, I suppose in late September, and go right to work on the stones, get them ready for a show or for a brochure or for the winter season. It's the surface of the stone is very different from any paper. And the reason for that is that when they grain a stone, they lap two stones together with carborundum dust and water in between them, and it gives a very sharp tooth. A paper, being a soft material, would have sort of bumps like that if you exaggerated, whereas a stone, the peaks are sharp because it's a hard material, you see. So when you're drawing it with a crayon, it has a different feeling from paper. And also, if you go over a pencil drawing, you go over and over it to make it darker, it begins to get shiny and slippery, you know how they... But on a lithograph stone, you can work over and over and over them, and they never lose that bloom.
Then I ran into Stowe when we were on the Fine Arts Committee at the Smithsonian Institute.
Right. You talked about that.
Yeah, and both Stowe and I finally decided, after going down there once a year to these occasions and sitting there with beautiful mornings when both of us should have been out drawing, which we were interested in, that we were actually wasting our time as well as theirs, I think. So we both resigned. Yes. I remember Stowe sidled up to me one day and he said, what are we doing in here? We ought to be out drawing.
Drawing on stone in infinite values of light and dark, making color irrelevant, seems like the artistic medium to best serve the craggy but grand Northeast. Stowe Wengenroth, a keen witness to rock, water, feather, and weathered shingle, saw the beauty of New England gray and made it art. If the Rocky Neck Art Colony were a galaxy, artist Mary McGarrity Shore would be a star glowing at its center, lightly touching everyone in this mid-20th century community of artists and thinkers on Cape Ann. But Mary Shore also had an extraordinary artistic friendship far beyond Cape Ann. The eldest of 8 children, Mary McGarrity was born in Philadelphia in 1912. Mary McGarrity studied at Cooper Union and the Chicago Art Institute, after which, married by then to John Shore, she settled in Gloucester, Massachusetts. The range of Shore's experiments with light, color, line, space, and materials confirm a powerfully intelligent eye, a lyrical touch, and an artist who never stopped believing that making art means asking questions. In 1947, Shore and friends helped transform the traditional Gloucester Society of Arts into the Cape Ann Society of Modern Artists. She exhibited her work with Albert Alcalay and Gordon Guterman, considered 2 of the greatest painters from this period on Cape Ann. Shore was close with poet Charles Olson, the sovereign chief of Gloucester's avant-garde. While he was away from Gloucester teaching, Olson wrote affectionate letters to Shore that reflect his respect for her as an artist and a friend. East Gloucester artists and neighbors Helen Stein and Nell Blaine were 2 of Shore's dearest confidants and colleagues. Gloucester's poet laureate Vincent Farini, also a local framer, created frames for Shore's works, and after Mary and John Shore divorced, for a very short time, Vincent Farini was married to Mary Shore. But there is an entirely separate and surprising dimension to Shore's personal life, which reflects in the sculptural assemblages she created with scavenged materials. Also summering in that East Gloucester neighborhood were artist friends Teresa Bernstein and William Meyerowitz, who spent their winters in New York City teaching and working. In the 1920s, sculptor Louise Nevelson, considered one of the most important artists of the 20th century, studied with Bernstein and Meyerowitz in New York. Nevelson later became famous for her large monochromatic constructions from scavenged materials. It is assumed that Shore met Nevelson, 12 years her senior, through these East Gloucester friends. Brian Shore, Mary Shore's son, remembers by the early 1950s helping his mother and Louise Nevelson scavenge for all kinds of driftwood and materials on Niles Beach. In her biography of Louise Nevelson, author Laurie Lyle says of the artist, she developed a lifelong friendship with a young painter named Mary Shore, who lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts, with her husband and 2 sons. Mary was a beachcomber, and every few months she loaded her station wagon with sea refuse and took it to Louise in New York. If the weather was good, the two might drive back to Gloucester together. Brian Shore remembers that Louise would set up a table with large baskets in their yard to sort all the beach scraps they had collected over days, imagining and choosing what would work best in her pieces. Shore introduced Charles Olson to Louise Nevelson. Lyle recounts a night in Gloucester with these 3 that ended with Olson attacking Nevelson for being famous. Nevelson walked out, refusing to ever see Olson again, and she did not, in spite of his written apology. Certainly, the Nevelson friendship supported Shore beyond Gloucester. In 1949, Mary Shore had a one-person show at the Norlist Gallery in New York City, where Nevelson also showed. The Norlist Gallery was founded by Jimmy Ernst, son of the surrealist painter Max Ernst. Jimmy Ernst was also secretary to Peggy Guggenheim. In 1947, a group of prominent national artists like Stuart Davis and Edward Hopper founded the Artists' Equity Association. The mission was to address business and economic issues that affected artists, such as providing health insurance. Shore's friend Louise Nevelson was president of the New York chapter. Mary Shore served as national director. You cannot look at this friendship without looking at Shore's and Nevelson's work. Certainly, the exchanges within the 2 women's friendship left unassailable marks on each other's pieces. Brian Shore remembers Nevelson telling him that parts of the wooden pieces he had found on Niles Beach are in the Museum of Modern Art. And certainly parts of Nevelson's friendship appear in Mary Shore's creations. They are more intimate and lyrical than Nevelson's, but they also refer to Nevelson's architecture, symbolism, and totem-like forms. But perhaps it is really the Gloucester Sea, the endless gifts the surf offered freely to these 2 artist friends, that connects all. Artist Joseph Salmon saw his star rise in the early part of the century, but then dim, darkened by arguable trends. His friends would become the super elites of the art world, while he quietly, sometimes angrily, continued to paint the mysteries of the material world. Ultimately, eminence found him, and sometimes it found him in the backyard of his summer cottage on Cape Ann. In 1934, the 25-year-old painter had his first one-person show in New York. Much of this 1930s work was inspired by the moody palette, flattened spaces, and loose brushwork of European Expressionism. A critic at the time wrote, "Salmon's color has an astonishingly rich quality that burns outward beneath the surface." Museums then were not showing this kind of work. New York in the 1930s was infatuated with social realism and a romanticized vision of America as portrayed by Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton. But Salmon's commitment to a new artistic vision, inspired by concepts arriving from Europe, would make him a leader among a provocative group of New York artists that included Mark Rothko, known then as Marcus Rothkowitz. They called themselves the 10, even though there were actually 9, figuring a like-minded 10th would not be hard to find. The group united over their commitment to these new ideas in art, but also over their frustration with what they saw as conservative choices in New York art institutions. In 1938, when the Whitney Museum excluded members of the 10 from its biennial show, the artists renamed themselves the Whitney Dissenters and held an exhibit of their own across the street. Although the group considered Salmon a leader, the alliance would not last. The next artistic movement of the century would part Joseph Salmon from his colleagues. Salmon's son, Paul Salmon, now a PBS NewsHour business and economics correspondent, talks about this time.
So that takes you up to a period where he's starting to get some recognition. The shows were all reviewed and is becoming sort of more popular through the 1940s. But that's the point at which, in my father's terms, and he was certainly somewhat bitter about it, when American art went abstract. And he thought that in the case of a number of people, not Rothko, but that a number of the guys who became really famous, Barnett Newman, for example, is one, Robert Motherwell is another, he thought it was a cynical effort playing to an audience of wealthy Americans. Henry Luce, the guy who ran Time Life and created Time magazine, who were trying to make a statement about the individuality of America versus the collectivism of the Soviet Union. We're now talking the Cold War, right? So abstract expressionism was American individualism. And there's plenty of evidence that the CIA sponsored shows in Europe of American art, which was abstract expressionism first and foremost. Life magazine made a big deal out of this group called the Irascibles that had Rothko in it, and Jackson Pollock and others. And so in that sense, my father was kind of left behind.
So, given his spirit for drawing and painting, Salmon could not easily abandon the material world. I have long discovered for myself, he said, that what we call the subject yields more pattern, more poetry, more drama, greater abstract design and tension than any shapes we may invent. Through the remaining century, realism and abstraction would remain a dance for Salmon and for the greater art world. Michael Kimmelman, writing for the New York Times, said the luminosity in Salmon's paintings might well have been the inspiration in friend Mark Rothko's mystical abstraction. Kimmelman also remarked that Salmon's paintings of New York skyscrapers are borderline abstraction. But perhaps what bothered Salmon the most were the categories. In the 1950s, he founded Reality with artists Edward Hopper and Jack Levine, a publication opposed to any one theory about how an artist should paint. With a wife and 2 children to support, Salmon supplemented the family income by working 6 months of the year at New York racetracks, selling pari-mutuel tickets. He sketched people on those subway trips, noting that subway riders are the perfect models because they hold so still, and also at the tracks themselves. Describing these portraits, Look magazine called Salmon the pari-mutuel Picasso. In 1951, Joseph Salmon discovered Cape Ann. At first, the Salmons rented an apartment on Rockport's Main Street, just overlooking Front Beach and Sandy Bay. He painted Rockport views like the headlands and the gazebo at Front Beach. Salmon later purchased a cottage overlooking the marsh in Gloucester. On the small screened-in porch there, he discovered monotypes, which Paul Salmon said changed his father's work permanently. While his paintings had always been relatively dark, the Cape Ann sky, sea, and the monotype process opened his canvas up to light and air. Salmon's commitment to the material subject ultimately earned him wall space in museums across the country, from the Hirshhorn to, yes, the Whitney. Joseph Salmon died in 2008 at 99 years old, after a day of sketching, gallery visiting, an ice cream cone, and scotch at night. Here is an excerpt showing Salmon producing monotypes on that Gloucester porch from a tribute Paul Salmon produced for the PBS NewsHour.
Finally tonight, the approach of Father's Day triggered this appreciation from correspondent Paul Salmon.
I'm Joe Salmon. I've turned 80, which staggered me a bit. At 79, I never minded bragging about my age. 80 was a solar plexus hit.
My dad, at his summer cottage near Boston in 1989. A full career already behind him, doing one of his monotypes.
So it's a delightful way of concentrating on small paintings with a great variety of subject matter.
Who knew Joe Salmon had 19 sweet years to go? Of his apparent immortality, he'd say it was kind of crazy. The secret? Scotch at night, he'd say, and half a grapefruit in the morning. He might have added women, song, old New York, new New York, motorcycles, Mozart, he did a book on him, his family, of course, Cape Ann, Massachusetts, and the backyard of his summer cottage there.
The luminous salmon color still glows. To see for yourself, walk into the Mercury Gallery in Rockport. The gallery was opened in 1994 with a focus on the work of that original expressionist group, the 10. Salmon's paintings are there. As that critic noted years ago, the astonishingly rich quality of that color, the quality Mark Rothko may have admired, still burns outward beneath the surface. Barbara Swann's paintings come boldly at you, whether it's a subject's mournful expression or the fluidity of refracted forms. The color, the composition, and the figures in Swann's paintings assert themselves, sometimes with poignancy, and sometimes because they are artfully unsettling. Her works hang in the National Portrait Gallery, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Art Institute of Chicago, to name a few. While seemingly very little about Barbara Swann aligns with the Cape Ann art community, she was perhaps the most Rockport of all Rockport artists. In a 1973 interview for the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, Swann explained that she was an only child and that she grew up in a household where there was no art, even though both her parents were natives of a famous art colony, Rockport, Massachusetts. Swann's father's family were Swedes who had immigrated to Rockport to work in the granite industry. Her grandfather, John Swann, was a well-known quarry foreman, working in what is now called Flat Ledge Quarry, but was then referred to as Swann's Quarry. Swann's mother's family crossed the Atlantic in the 17th century, settling in Pigeon Cove. That grandfather, Captain William David Knowlton, sailed a steamer, the William H. Moody, out of Pigeon Cove, delivering Rockport granite to building projects along the eastern seaboard. He was killed at 43 years old when a derrick fell on him. Barbara Swann once said, "When you consider the sea captain father on my mother's side and the granite industry foreman on my father's, this was good, worthy labor." Swann was born in 1922, After graduating from Wellesley to please her father, she studied art under the German expressionist Karl Zerb at Boston School of the Museum of Fine Arts. Her vision later evolved, but Swann's painting never lost the expressionistic freshness of those early years. She lived and painted in France at Sanary-sur-Mer from 1949 to 1951. She met her husband, Alan Fink, at that time in Paris. In 1961, married with 2 children by then, Swann was one of 21 women to be accepted into the first group of fellows at Radcliffe's Institute for Independent Studies. The institute was founded by Radcliffe president Polly Bunting, who believed that many American women who had stopped promising careers to have families faced what she called a climate of unexpectation. At Radcliffe, Swann became close friends with poets Anne Sexton and Maxine Kumin. She created a number of important portraits of her poet friends, including a drawing of Anne Sexton when she was visiting Swann in Rockport. The intense working friendship Swann shared with Sexton and Kumin drew her into extraordinary collaborations. Swann provided the cover drawing for Sexton's poetry collection, Live or Die, published in 1966. And she illustrated Kumin's Upcountry, Poems of New England, published in 1972. Both collections received the Pulitzer Prize. But perhaps the most provocative illustrations Swann created were for Sexton's book, Transformations. A hard-boiled retelling of Grimm's fairy tales in poetry, Swann connected instantly to Sexton's contemporary interpretations. As soon as she read the poem Snow White, a universal confrontation between aging beauty and young beauty, she called her friend to say, "My God, Anne, I love that poem. I identify with that poor old queen." As Swann reports, Anne then replied, "So do I." After multiple attempts, Sexton would take her life 2 years later. Swann's husband, Alan Fink, opened the Alpha Gallery in Boston in 1967. From its inception, the Alpha Gallery has exhibited emerging, mid-career, and established contemporary artists, as well as 20th century historical figures and modern masters. Today, their daughter, Joanna Fink, runs the gallery. Swann's son, Aaron Fink, is also a painter. His works hang in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Gallery of Art, among others. Across her artistic career, Swann remained a quiet steward for her family's Rockport heritage. Her home in Pigeon Cove, now owned by her children and theirs, is just a short walk from John Swann's quarry. Aaron Fink still paints in his mother's studio. Swann died in 2003 at age 80. Her mother, Clara Knowlton Swann, daughter of that Pigeon Cove ship captain, died 5 days before her daughter at the age of 106. Joanna Fink says they believe the mother intuitively just did not want to outlive her daughter. This is the story of someone who grew up 1 generation away from Rockport's most revered work, quarrying and shipping stone. Swann said her father never wanted her to be an artist. He believed the artist's lifestyle was antithetical to the kind of hard work his family had valued. Perhaps Swann's Rockport heritage and her art were not so much apart. Perhaps they have sustained each other all along as one. Art in the family tradition was Barbara Swann's good, worthy labor. In the northwest corner of Gloucester, a shingled cottage perches on Washington Street, facing Folly Cove. Many people know this building as where the Folly Cove designers printed their textiles. But the most recent resident of this unassuming home would quietly and humbly advance some of the most provocative artistic concepts of the time. This building was summer home and studio from 1975 until he died in 2018 to Ralph Coburn, an artist who moved softly among giants and who created a temporal body of work with groundbreaking vision. The Boston Globe art critic Sebastian Smee wrote in 2010, "Not enough people know about Coburn's work, which is spare, beautiful, witty, and uncannily satisfying. Coburn himself, I've been told, is modest to a fault, which is no doubt one reason why we don't know more about him." Born in 1923, Coburn grew up in Miami, Florida. He studied architecture at MIT, but the war interrupted his studies. Disqualified from the Army for vision problems, Coburn returned to Florida to work as a draftsman in the Miami Air Force. This background, MIT's emphasis on invention across all departments, those years drafting airplane parts in 2 dimensions, would later separate Coburn from his friends who had studied in art schools. Coburn at times felt inadequate about his drawing skills and the lack of traditional art background, but these years at MIT and working with blueprints would inform the novel direction towards which his work would ultimately go. Coburn returned to Boston after the war, this time to officially study painting and to work at the Boris Mirsky Gallery. Boris Mirsky was determined to cultivate an avant-garde in Boston. And Coburn reconnected with a group of Boston friends he had met earlier, friends who had been studying at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. One of those friends, Barbara Swan, introduced Coburn and the rest of their group to Cape Ann, probably in 1947, when she rented a studio for the summer on Bearskin Neck. Her family went back generations in Rockport. But it was their friend Ellsworth Kelly with whom Coburn had the most critical bond. Kelly would go on to become internationally famous for his hard-edged abstraction. In 1949, Kelly invited Coburn to France.
All the kids went to Paris. All the art students at the museum school. I don't know why, but Paris was a mecca. I went to Paris following a letter from Ellsworth. "Paris, Ralph, you must come over here. Paris is the city for you."
The 2 young Boston artists had found the swooshes and drips of abstract expressionism, which had been dominating the American art scene, unappealing. They were younger than Franz Kline, Jackson Pollock, and Willem de Kooning, who ruled this movement. Coburn and Kelly went to Europe looking for the picture-building intellectualism of the modernist abstractionists like Matisse, Paul Klee, and Picasso.
We tried to meet Picasso. We went to his studio. Kelly went up to the front door. It was a house in the suburbs of Paris. And his wife, Jacqueline, came to the door, and I saw her shaking her head and smiling. "No, you can't see him." When Kelly got back in, "You can't see him, he's working."
As Pollock spattered paint, in Europe, artists in all mediums were responding to the Surrealist and Dadaist movements. Concepts, not still lives, were their subjects. John Cage was in Paris composing music by the flip of a coin, using chance as a means of deciding pitch and notes. His partner, dancer Merce Cunningham, was applying the same radical theories of time and space to the ballet bar.
The minute I got to the hotel, out bounded John Cage and Merce Cunningham. John Cage immediately introduced himself to me. Very cheerful, very positive. Kelly had never heard of him. And he had, of course, never heard of Kelly either. Kelly was not famous then.
Coburn and Kelly both began to reduce elements in their paintings down to their most minimal form, void of layers of meaning or interpretation. Color was color and shape was shape. Painting for these two became architectural. As mentioned, Coburn's background had prepared him for this embrace of two dimensions. He had no traditional art education from which he needed to free himself, as Kelly may have. Coburn's background was in blueprints, flat forms, and finished drawings, not landscapes. So when Kelly began working with Chance, Coburn asked, "Well, this has been done. What can I do that's original?" Again, that MIT discipline that emphasized invention, not imitation. And so Coburn moved away from Chance and all alone towards something he called choice. Coburn created a number of works in this time simply labeled Arranged by Choice, each a series of separate canvases contained in a rectangle that could be rearranged in almost infinite combinations. The person hanging the work has the choice of arranging the canvases as they wish, therefore participating in the creation of the work. In short, each painting comes with an invitation to partner with the artist. Coburn called this concept participatory. From these pieces, Coburn shifted again, this time breaking apart the contained rectangle. In this phase, each work became a number of different panels intended to be arranged over a wall as the collaborator chooses. Suddenly and radically, the relationship between painting and wall changed. The painting became an active part of a whole environment, not something depicting a translated message of elsewhere and hanging static on a wall. And again, the person hanging the work participates in each new composition. Later, Coburn moved past these participatory pieces and began to elevate the grid itself as a concept, as in this shimmering work entitled Folly Cove, and this evening painting. Coburn's modesty may account for yet another underreported achievement. In 1957, he left France for good, returning to Boston to work as a layout artist and typographer, designing posters and graphics at MIT's Office of Publications, where he remained for years. It was in this design studio that Coburn has recently been credited with moving the team toward the Swiss design he had seen in Europe, practically importing the Helvetica font. The Coburn concepts, choice, participation, and what he called random sequence, created by him in the 1950s, had not been seen before. Coburn conceptualized mutability and interactivity, pioneering what became ruling themes in art in the 20th century. The scholarship on Coburn is just catching up. As Sebastian Smee says, perhaps because Coburn was shy about success and naturally deferential. His work hangs in the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis. The Museum of Fine Arts Boston owns a number of Coburn pieces. In 2012, the Cape Ann Museum held an exhibition of his work entitled Arranged by Choice. And Coburn had his first national exhibition entitled Ralph Coburn Random Sequence at the Art Club of Chicago in 2017. Coburn was 94. As his work moves into prominence, the story of his pioneering concepts is being rewritten. And this element of Coburn's life cannot be discounted. The fact that even art critics note his humility, his graciousness, and his kindness. Perhaps there was artistic power in that kindness. The way architecture and drafting informed Coburn's work, perhaps the nature of his personality informed it too, particularly in his participatory pieces. "Come, let's do this together," Coburn said, building inclusiveness and generosity into every painting. Still standing by the road in Folly Cove is the little studio, as modest a building as Coburn was an artist, but where he imagined, invented, and created. his feet on Folly Cove floorboards, and his mind full of ideas born in a Paris friendship. Architect Noel Michael McKinnell was a principal designer for the most famous concrete building in the world, Boston City Hall. McKinnell also created a large body of significant paintings in his Rockport, Massachusetts studio. To see these paintings, studies of the weight of things, the texture of things, the spaces around them, and how forms intersect on a plane, is to see how art and architecture, for this man, were different mediums professing the same modernist vow: honor materials and create with authenticity. In 1962, McKinnell was a 26-year-old graduate student in architecture, studying at Columbia University on a Fulbright grant from his native England. He and his professor, Gerhard Kallman, who eventually became his mentor, entered a competition to design a new city hall for Boston, and they won. Controversial from jump, people described the brutalist design as looking like an Aztec gas station. Years later, Marty Walsh campaigned for mayor of Boston on a promise to bulldoze it away.
You know, if you're ugly, people notice you and you can become endearing. If you're, blah, people pass you in the street, they don't notice you, they don't see you,
In 1976, the American Institute of Architects named Boston City Hall the best building in the country designed by a living architect. Boston City Hall stands today as one of the most famous buildings and one of the most polemical. But McKinnell's and Kallman's vision both absorbed and deflected all that.
We'd never thought that we would build a finished building because we thought that any building for a city hall should encourage and even endure the interventions of passing generations. We were kids when we won the competition, and it shows. And now it's the next generations, or the next generation one should be doing this with their ideas. It's the people's building, and we always wanted it to be taken over by the people to do their thing in it.
The illustrious project ultimately led to the formation of the architecture firm Kallman, McKinnell & Wood, and to a lifetime of significant commissions, civic buildings and spaces, academic projects, museums, and embassies all around the world. McKinnell's wife, Stephanie Malice, also an architect and painter, says that her husband's buildings are about the site, the progressions of spaces, and that McKinnell had a real understanding of materials and the craft of using them. McKinnell and Malice came to Rockport in 1991. Malice had been working for architect I.M. Pei in New York, and McKinnell was working in Boston. They wanted a retreat for Michael on weekends, and Rockport had a sense of place. The two architects purchased a modest wooden house with a deep backyard extending to Sandy Bay. Their art studio looks across the garden to that piece of Atlantic Ocean. As an artist, McKinnell was always looking at Picasso, Braque, and Bonnard. But the character of materials ruled his canvases. Architect and educator Mark Pasnick says of McKinnell's paintings, "It is a world of vibrant color, tantalizing geometries, and intensified patterns, one as lovingly attuned to the value of materials as McKinnell was in any of his architectural projects." Materials are McKinnell's subject, and Cape Ann's granite and quarries are his artistic foundation. He actually calls his still lifes domesticated quarries because he composed them with the same deliberate building of forms with which he composed his quarry paintings. McKinnell's work later became even more about the honesty of the plain, a stripped-down realism that traces back to the modernist concepts he considered as a young architect designing a concrete city hall. But perhaps the most important subject in these paintings is Michael McKinnell. The very redness of a small shack evokes a smile. There is delight in the way a Killam rug boldly outshines the furniture. There's something tender about a small wedge of cliff appearing shyly at the top of a jaunty dance between cut granite and curving path. And there's something affectionate about the Gloucester Times, providing that revered sense of place in a still life. As an architect, McKinnell's eye never stopped carefully and honestly examining precisely how the world comes together. As an artist, in both his buildings and his painting, McKinnell clearly found joy in the dynamism of physical matter. Stephanie Mallis says that McKinnell found joy in looking and being. McKinnell taught for years at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and at MIT. His buildings were fixtures in the global design canon. When he died suddenly of the coronavirus in 2020 at the age of 84, the global architectural community grieved. But his works remain monuments to the delight this artist found observing the potent relationship of materials, be it concave concrete or a plate of fruit, to space. Czar Fedorsky lives on a short lane spotted with old quarries and neighbors' houses in the Lanesville Woods, the northernmost village of Gloucester, Massachusetts. In 2018, Czar received a Guggenheim Award for her series of photographs entitled The Light Under the Door, a collection of tense but ethereal black and white images shot in and around Czar's home. Much of Czar's work speaks to the tension between the beautiful familiarity of place and longing for someplace else. About The Light Under the Door, Czar says she wanted to create a photo narrative about a woman who dreams of a larger life. Comfortable at home, she also yearns to experience the broader world. At times, she feels alone. She seeks comfort in art, literature, and her imagination. Czar moved to Rockport as a child. She attended Rockport middle and high schools, but that journey reveals ambivalence, a belief that maybe she should be elsewhere. It's almost a surprise that Cape Ann is home.
Well, I was born in New Orleans, and my mom quickly divorced our father, so I never got to know him. And around the age of 4, we moved to Greenwich Village. And so even though I didn't spend that much time in New Orleans, I always feel like it's a part of me, and I've returned a lot, just kind of curious about all the places that we lived. And we were in the French Quarter. She was an artist, and she worked as a street painter on the, I think she did portraits and things like caricatures. And my father was actually very good with watercolor and did caricatures in watercolor in the moment, which was supposed to be really hard. So my mom was self-taught. So we moved to New York City, and that's where I spent about 10 years. I feel like those were a big portion of my childhood, especially living in an urban environment, Greenwich Village in the 60s. It was, really fantastic. And we came to Cape Ann during the summers. My mother had, she was born in Fitchburg and brought up in Fitchburg in the Depression era, and she just couldn't wait to get out. So she never really wanted to come back, but she thought, well, it was just hard being a single mom in New York City in the 70s. And we were coming here for the summers. And one year, the New York City schools went on strike, and they just kept going on strike, and she decided to stay here, so we stayed. That's how we ended up moving here. Yeah, it was very, just one of those things, we just stayed.
After undergraduate studies at Amherst College, Saar intended to study international business and moved to Washington, D.C. She trained as a stockbroker, but before starting grad school, Saar visited San Francisco. There, she happened to walk into the doors of the Art Institute and serendipitously met photographer Jock Sturgis, famous for photographs of children and teenagers. That felicitous meeting swapped out Saar's business career for photography. After studying at the Academy of Art College in San Francisco, she returned to Massachusetts and worked as a photojournalist, freelancing for UPI, the Boston Globe, and even the Gloucester Times. But Saar's parents' artistic lives remained a sovereign message inside her. Around 2000, Saar joined a photography critique group led by Nubar Alexanian, an international photographer and journalist. The Boston Globe said of Alexanian's photos, "They are metaphors. Read them like a poem." Alexanian became then, and still is, an essential mentor for Saar. In 2012, she returned to school for an MFA. Saar shoots in black and white, saying this way the photographs shed realism for abstraction. She also enjoys printing zeotypes, an alternative print process that involves hand-coated paper and digital negatives. This allows her to produce unique prints with a handmade feel from digitally captured images. Saar left the literal messages of photojournalism for a different language, abstraction and emotion, almost 20 years ago. She says the Guggenheim Award affirmed this course, and that felt good. And it also affirmed for her that work made from home can matter.
The way I saw the Guggenheims, I really felt I had made a lot of the right decisions. Like, even though there was so many struggles, that was just a good, a nice stamp of approval. But it also confirmed, not that only just that all the hard work was paying off, but also that I was going in the right direction, because The Light Under the Door had just been published. And I really believed that the personal work, it seemed like, as much as I wanted to travel, it seemed like you could make really a strong body of work within, even here, like my home, and within 200 yards of this house. So most of the images from The Light of the Door photographed really close to the home.
The Guggenheim Award invited Saar to ask, could she make photographs away from her home in Gloucester? Could she create work someplace else that still held parts of her? She chose to travel to Oaxaca, Mexico. Saar is still editing this series entitled The Light Across the Border. She is still trying to understand what these images actually mean to her. Meanwhile, she is home again in Lanesville, shooting photographs of quarries in her neighborhood. These images seem to record the mark of infinity within a fractured second of time and space. Lessons in vastness, just steps from her Lanesville home.
There's a picture of 10 Pound Island, and I'm shooting with a panorama camera. I shot it, probably a dozen times. I lined up that high water mark with the line of the city of Gloucester, and that was where it connected. It really is how the camera sees in the end.
Photojournalist, documentary filmmaker, photographer, artist. Nubar Alexanian has been looking at the world through a camera lens for over 50 years. His resume includes spreads across pages in Life magazine, the New York Times Magazine, Boston Magazine, and many more. Alexanian spent 5 years following musicians like Paul Simon and Emmylou Harris for his book, Where Music Comes From. He collaborated with renowned trumpeter Wynton Marsalis to create a small personal book entitled Jazz. From 1978 to 1989, Alexanian traveled to Peru, multiple trips facilitated by a Fulbright Award. The darks and lights of the images in that resulting book, Stones in the Road, act on the page with so much power they seem to have sinew and muscle. Alexanian has lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts for 50 years. He has created 2 books photographing that city, images that confess the day-to-day pathos and glory of this immigrant fishing community. And yet, at this point in his life, Alexanian is examining answers he thought he understood and posing new questions. Looking hard, for instance, at what exactly is a photograph, and asking the question with fresh emotion, what is home?
I would not use the word truth with photographs. I would use the word honesty. My sandbox is images metaphor, which means that my pictures are about how I feel about what I'm looking at. A photograph does not have to be about what's in front of the camera in order to be an honest picture. And that's where I live.
Feeling off balance, uncomfortable, is a place Alexanian trusts artistically.
Not knowing what you're doing is an important part of the process of making art. And for me, it's really important because if I know what I'm doing, most of the time I'm in a place I've already been.
And yet he's acutely aware of the difference between making art and photojournalism. In the 1980s, Alexanian decided to shoot a photo essay, his first, on Gloucester's most successful fishing family. He spent 2 years with the Brancaleone family, including 4 10-day offshore trips in which he was miserably seasick. Alexanian took this photo essay to New York City, where from a payphone, he called the photo editor of Geo magazine. He said, "I'm downstairs. If you give me 10 minutes of your time, I'm sure you will buy this story." And she did. Later, that editor went on to Fortune magazine, and Alexanian went with her. He says that every project he's worked on has been a risk, but he believes in risk. In 2012, Alexanian's daughter Abby asked, "Will you go with me to Armenia?" Alexanian had grown up in a 100% Armenian family, resettled in Worcester, Massachusetts. He spoke Armenian as a child. He traveled to 30 countries for work, but he knew nothing about Armenia. In 1915, under the cover of World War I, the Ottoman Turks murdered 1.5 million ethnic Armenians. Alexanian's 4 grandparents fled 4 different villages in what was historically Armenia, but which is considered Turkey today. The photographer and his daughter arranged to go on a guided tour of this area with 10 other people, each preparing to visit the villages where their relatives had lived. Alexanian was completely unprepared for the emotions he would feel. He later returned to historic Armenia with a cameraman. This journey became Alexanian's most recent documentary, entitled Finding Armenia, a dramatic narrative that ultimately asks, what is home?
I live in a fishing village here in Massachusetts. It's a great place. I've lived here for 50 years. This is home to me, but there's another home. If you're an immigrant, there has to be another home.
From his early professional years, Alexanian has viewed his subjects with a stark sensitivity. His book Jazz opens with the words of American saxophonist Ornette Coleman. These words could apply also to what Alexanian sees when he takes a picture. Every living thing has something inside of it that does not want to die. Find out what that is and play that.